Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming back for an afternoon that promises to be equally stimulating and enjoyable. I'm Betsy Bolman, and I have the honor of moderating this panel. And the panel title is, What Makes a Monument? And I think that that's a question that everyone in this room would probably come up with a different answer to, and we're looking forward to a very robust discussion period with the audience after our distinguished speakers say some remarks. And so we're deviating somewhat from the procedure of this morning. I'm not going to give elaborate introductions. We're just going to start with Amanda and go down, and each of our colleagues here is going to introduce herself and talk about the subject of the panel and how that, what it means to her. So please, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda D. King. I am a visual artist, cultural organizer, and the creative director of Shooting Without Bullets, a nonprofit creative agency and production company utilizing cultural production as creative strategy for social movement. And I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Kristen Windmuller-Luna. I'm the Curator of African Arts here at the CMA. Really nice to see people in person, and congratulations to the organizers for a lovely event so far.
And I'm Grace Chin. I'm the director of the Sculpture Center. I started 2.5 years ago, but have been in Cleveland for 16 years, and I too am very excited to be part of this discussion.
Great, and I just want to start over again in the same sequence and have you say something about what monuments mean to you. And I would like to remind us of the Monument Lab definition, which I think is very capacious, statements of power and presence in public. So you can either respond to their definition or give us your definition and what that means to you in Cleveland today.
Okay, are we presenting our slides?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Okay.
I think I'm going first.
All right, how do I do this?
We'll see who shows. Just hit the,
Okay.
Yes, Amanda, I think I'm
Alrighty.
talking first.
apologies.
That's okay. Okay. If you're from here, I'm not sure if you know about the Sculpture Center. I thought I'd share a little bit about it before I talk about the work that we've been doing regarding outdoor art and monuments and sculpture. So the Sculpture Center has been around for 31 years, and since I started, we're really taking a look at where we've been and where we're going. So the mission of the Sculpture Center, we are one of the only cultural institutions providing critical resources to sculptors along their journey. And where we're headed, our vision is to become a regionally and nationally recognized cultural space for sculptors where creative ideas, experiences in the community connect and flourish. And when I talk about space, I'm not necessarily talking about a room, but really what's around us. When I started, I have a very particular interest in public art, mostly in art that is site-specific and relevant to its site, and also public art that is driven by community engagement. So what I'm hoping is that what we do is will become a part of a larger movement to describe the spaces that we live in. I should also mention the Sculpture Center is the custodian of the Ohio Outdoor Sculpture Database. And what that is an online database of over 1,500 outdoor sculptures throughout the state of Ohio. It's a collection that is always growing. We always need volunteers to, fill in the gaps. But each of the pieces has photographs, collection information, artist information, anything we can gather. And so all of that lives on a database. And I'm actually very curious if Dr. Paul Farber used that in part of his Mellon research.
And excuse me, could we see the slides that we see here on the monitor in the background? We started out with the slides and then, oh, excellent, good, okay, great.
Thank you. Well, we can move on to the next slide, actually.
You can press the green button.
Oh. So let me tell you a little bit about a project we recently launched this summer where we were looking at temporary art experiences and mostly conducted through augmented reality. I did not mean to change that.
No, it didn't change. It's fine. It just blinks. Sorry, everybody.
Okay, I'm sorry, this is
Little logistical challenge here.
new to me. But we created this program called Crossroads, and we used that title because we wanted to look at the intersections of many different ideas, and not just look at them, but crossroads, meaning you have to make a decision. You have to think about it and make a choice as to what happens next. And so we created a unique augmented reality gallery experience showcasing the stories behind the work, the artists, the sites, and the neighborhoods. So it's all encompassing in terms of the stories behind the people creating the work, behind their actual artwork, where their art is located, the specific site, and the neighborhood in which their artwork is living. It's accessible, so it's viewable 24/7, and augmented reality means you're using your own personal device, so a smartphone to view the artwork. And finally, we rounded out this exhibition by expanding all of our programs, all of our artwork with community conversations and dialogues that sort of brought more dialogue around the topics. So what I love about augmented reality is that it's both there and not there. It shows what's past and present, about what's spoken and not spoken, and also what's here and not here. So we had 12 artists, and I'm actually proud to say, Amanda, my panel cohort, was one of our 12 artists. So each artist chose a site, and this particular site was chosen by an artist in Cleveland. Her name is Gwen Garth. And she chose the site of what was once the Majestic Hotel in Cleveland, which is on 55th Street in the central neighborhood. This building once housed, it was a hotel designed for African Americans. It was 5 stories, as you can see, a beautiful brick building, and was one of the largest hotels for African Americans in Ohio at one point. It was demolished in let's see, when was it demolished? I believe in the 80s. And what grew in its footprint was the building on the lower part, which is, a very flat-looking building, and it housed the Goodwill Industries. That building is still there, however, Goodwill is no longer there, and it is a vacant building. And so what Gwen pointed out with her artwork, and she actually had a very personal experience with the Majestic Hotel, where she lived there for a period of time when her family suffered a fire in their house. And her belief is she wants to use the building that's there presently to draw attention to the past, but also to pull it into the present where she would like to have that building and create a community arts center. Another of our artists, Gina Washington, whose single portrait, that is her. She grew up in East Cleveland, and as a child, playing at on the base of the Forest Hills footbridge, which the Forest Hills Park divides East Cleveland and Cleveland Heights, 2 completely different communities. And what she wanted to do was draw attention to the fact that where she grew up, East Cleveland, a lot of people have this perception that East Cleveland is an unsafe place. Here in University Circle, the bridge on Euclid around 120th is sort of a divider. Don't go past the bridge. Actually, the Sculpture Center is right past the bridge. Don't go past the bridge, it's not safe. However, she wants to kind of, her hope is to change that common perception. Since she grew up there, she photographed friends, relatives, and community members who live in East Cleveland, and she created their portraits, each of them holding an I am statement. I am being the two most, she believes, the two most powerful words one can say about themselves. And created this collage. In augmented reality, she enlarged it so it spans the whole length of the bridge. In effect, this community is forming a bridge in today's Forest Hills Park. And finally, the last one I want to tell you about is the Sideway Bridge, which is between it exists between the Kinsman and Slavic Village neighborhoods. The Slavic Village, the Sideway Bridge has a very, very interesting history behind it. If you're not aware and you're curious, I highly recommend you look it up beyond what I'm about to tell you. But it was, the one that exists now was built in 1927 and was and is still the only suspension bridge in Cleveland. It connected the two neighborhoods, and it had a wooden plankway that residents could walk back and forth between Kinsman and Slavic Village. In the 60s, during the Huff riots, the wooden plank was burned, literally severing the two communities. And so you can see the middle picture. It's really, the bridge is still standing because of the metalwork that existed. However, it's overgrown, ignored. It's actually not safe in terms of accessible to go there. Our artist, Shawnee Richards, created her own Sideway Bridge, basically reconstructing it. And she could not place it in front of the entrance of Sideway Bridge because we couldn't tell people how to get there. So she placed it very close in front of a church, which is well known in the community as being a community resource. And she recreated her bridge with the hope that it will become part of a larger movement to one day rebuild the bridge and become a community asset, a historic marker. And so in the last photograph, you can see the bridge and how people are interacting with the augmented reality piece. So, thank you.
So my definition of a monument is a dynamic public marker of culture that shapes our socio-political understanding of and relationship to society. I'm interested in building monuments that advance representation and mobility for those who are not recognized in public space or history, facilitate encounters in which personal and societal transformation are possible, monuments that are building momentum for social movement, and that create human togetherness and belonging. In architect David Adjei's Making Memory exhibition, he describes the form of monuments and our experiences with them as ever-changing. To Adjei, they are no longer just static objects like sculptures and statues and plaques, but dynamic and complex spaces with a variety of functions. In this moment of reimagining what society looks like, we have creative license to build monuments with makeshift objects, images and media, street art, apparel, and augmented reality, for example. Monuments have historically upheld whiteness, violence, and conquest, and their existence reinforces the legacy of inequity, brutality, and the displacement of people of color in the US, which is why so many of them have fallen in recent years. They are still sites of contention for Black and brown bodies. We oft exist in stark opposition to the monuments we encounter. And in one of my favorite photographer, Carrie Mae Weems' work, Echoes of Marion, she speaks to this. The image depicts her in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and her vulnerable body is juxtaposed against the stark backdrop of the white, pristine memorial. And the work reinforces the size and physical position of Weems as a Black woman in proximity to the memorial, invoking questions of gender and racial inequality, access, and agency. Oh, actually, can I go back? I was too fast.
Could you reverse the slide, please?
So on one of the slides, which is, darn it, so, oh, there we go, thank you so much. So Inhale, Exhale is a socially conscious apparel collection by my organization, Shooting Without Bullets, and explores themes of uprising in response to the growing racial and economic precarity in Cleveland. And it features a graphic of the free stamp by Claes Oldenburg on the front, and the mantra, free from oppressive structures, free from oppressive illusions on the back. In the wake of extrajudicial killings by police, the free stamp has become a backdrop for political dissent, cries of inequity, and confrontation between civilian and the police. It is very proximate to the county jail. The free stamp is, our free stamp crew neck is a reclamation of the meaning of freedom and the position of the Black body in public space. It flips the idea of who owns the monument on its head by transforming it from sculpture to streetwear. Alexander Bell's A Kid with Promise is a large-scale poster of a news article about the police killing of Michael Brown, that is edited and redacted by the artist and wheat pasted on buildings in New York. A Kid with Promise is also a counter monument that preserves his memory, shifts racist narratives surrounding his death, and disrupts space, especially for those who fail to acknowledge the daily indignities of racial injustice in the US. Similarly, in 2020, during the 2020 election, one of the most divisive in US history, Shooting Without Bullets in Our DNA campaign used wheat pasting in public space to honor the civic contributions of historic Black Clevelanders to spark dialogue about racial justice. Our installation on the ACLU of Ohio functions as a makeshift monument that shifted civic dialogue from partisan conversation about who should lead the country to discourse about the embodiment of civic leadership within every citizen, especially Black citizens. There we go. As a process of reclamation, everyday resistors like myself and so many other people in this room or who work in proximity to Shooting Without Bullets in this ecosystem and beyond, we're building our own monuments as solutions to combating inequity by providing representation, access, and opportunity for those most excluded to participate in public space. And in 2022, Shooting Without Bullets will implement a large-scale public artwork conceptualized by Black girls ages 12 to 17 as a solution to gender and racial disparities in the arts. It will be a multifunctional sculpture that provides opportunity to showcase artworks by those most excluded from traditional art spaces while engaging residents and partners in a community decision-making process. Thank you.
In my role as Curator of African Arts here at CMA, it is my honor and responsibility to care for some 450 works of African art and to keep the galleries in which they are housed dynamic and multivocal. I'm a historian, so I'm always thinking about the past, and monuments play a big part in that. Always read the plaque and always look at what's on the back could probably be one of my mottos. It really is true. At heart, what that means is to see and learn what is at the surface level, but also to be aware of what more there is to uncover. What is missing, physical or intangible? What is the difference between looking at something in its original context or through our contemporary perspectives? How do these perspectives, past and present, affect ideas of what a monument is. For me, the concept of what a monument is and how it is cared for is necessarily elastic as well as culturally and site-specific. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved in Ethiopia between the 7th and 13th centuries, are active worship sites. UNESCO has declared them a World Heritage Site. There is a push and pull between the equally valid needs of faith and architectural soundness at Lalibela, whether erecting large canopies to prevent the effects of water damage or collecting stone dust generated by restorations because it is sacred. The Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove in Nigeria is another UNESCO World Heritage Site. Declared a Nigerian National Monument in 1965, both organizations oversee its 180 acres. Yoruba sacred groves are active spaces, so the benefits of becoming monumentalized are ambiguous. On one hand, the site is protected from development, and funds and person power are allocated to care for it. On the other, the site risks becoming ossified, preserved in the mid-20th century moment when the movement of new sacred artists created sculptures like this. Monuments tied to religious sites like Lalibela or the Osun-Osogbo Grove attest to the power of faith as well as that of governments or organizations. While tradition evolves and is not carved in stone with a capital T, becoming monument means risking stasis. When declared as monuments or cultural heritage sites, physical locations, as well as intangible heritage like food or dance or ritual, are asked to not change. This is even if not changing is detrimental to today's people, whether hampering worship and innovation or serving as a barrier to the practical needs of housing or sanitation. Are monuments meant to be forever? I don't always believe so. Monuments can reflect the time or people who created them, rather than what they're supposedly meant to hail. Statues erected to Confederate leaders reflect 1920s racism, rather than the Civil War of the 1800s. Those of men like Andrew Jackson promote ideals of the American frontier, the heroic equestrian distracting from his anti-abolitionist policies and the atrocities he perpetuated against Native Americans. In 2018, I marched with others in New Orleans to have statues taken down, including one of Jackson. According to family lore and a now lost genealogical chart, Jackson is a distant relative. He is not a man for whom I wish to see a monument remain standing. I research iconoclasm, which is often seen as a negative act, like the destruction, removal, or defacing of artwork in ancient Rome, the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s, or the Aladura revival of the 1930s. But iconoclasm also has creative, generative power, namely the power of making space for other stories, other people, other histories. Here, 2 photographs taken in Central Park show making space in action. One is the new Women's Rights Pioneers sculpture, a much-needed depiction of actual women in a city where only 5 existed before. At right is the boxed-over tribute to Dr. Marion J. Sims, a gynecologist who gravely mistreated Black enslaved women, including Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, during his research. His statue was removed in 2018 after 50 years of questioning his ethics. A community coalition led discussions about its future, and a new monument to affirm the rights of women and people of color is planned. I'll end on a local note, Cleveland's Monument to the 4 Freedoms. I don't know when it was made, but it bears President Roosevelt's 4 freedoms of 1941. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Walking past this monument often in 2020, I dwelled on the panel, Freedom from Fear, transposing my own concerns about pandemics and the fate of democracy onto this World War II statement. The past is for the present. The question is, in creating or considering monuments, do we acknowledge that we build and interpret them for our own times? To think that we can do otherwise is to claim foolishly that we can stop time. Perhaps it is time instead to think of monuments as entities in motion and to consider their role in creating both past and present.
I don't know why that's...
Okay, sorry. We don't let the slide at the present time. Thank you. So thank you all for such deep and insightful comments about presence and absence and place and memory and who does get to speak and who doesn't. I have some prepared questions about absence and about monuments in Cleveland, but first, Amanda, I want to ask you if you'd talk to us a little bit more about that project that involves the young women that you're working on now.
Sure. So a part of Shooting Without Bullets' artistic activism model is that we train up young artist activists starting at 12 years old and ending at 21. And we taught a mini course. Our mini courses teach a creative skill. This time it was public art making, and we tackle a complex issue, gender and racial disparities in the arts. They worked for they had a 12-week curriculum where we looked at public art all over the country. And then they became the architects of their own public artwork. And this artwork, they said that they wanted it to be unifying, but they also wanted it to be functional. So what it is it's a place to showcase artworks of women of color, but it also can function as a bus shelter or a gazebo for respite. And within the shelter are panels in which artwork can be implemented and taken out according to trends, according to moments, according to what society may need to be questioning and interrogating. And it was so wonderful because these were their ideas that then our creative agency worked with an architect, Stephen Menka, to ideate around and come up with the renderings. And as a special part of the process, taking our young people from people who are interested in art to artist activists, they actually went in front of the City Planning Commission and they presented their work. And it was conceptually approved because we didn't have anything to show for it. But we're working with Land Studio now and the Buckeye community to implement it. And it's on schedule for 2022.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so exciting. Yes. And so one of the themes that the three of you have addressed is really transience and, as I said a moment ago, voices that haven't been expressed. Your very moving discussion of some of those digital projects, Grace, was really powerful. And I wonder if, having heard your colleagues here on the stage talk about these themes, if you have other thoughts that you want to share with us and the audience on that subject.
Well, really what struck me about hearing my colleagues speak, Amanda, about making monuments personal, not something you see, but something you own, but worn in different ways. I love that concept. And you know, for me, the monument is not necessarily an object, but it's I guess a concept. What do you call that word? A sphere, something. I'm just blanking out on the word, but this. And then I love looking at other cultures because it's not, when we're talking about monuments, we tend to think of ourselves in the Western world, but I think when we talk about historical monuments, that we're not just talking about a specific point in time either. And so I really, all of this resonates with me.
Kristen, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Amanda, I love the project you were doing with those young women and the idea that it can adapt to who they are, who they're becoming, who their community is coming. And I see that too very much in which the artists you worked with and supported the Sculpture Center. The idea of seeing a place and making it so accessible. That to me is really the key of so much of what we're talking about, that kind of accessibility and that kind of adaptability.
Great. did you want to respond to anything you heard?
Oh my gosh, it was all so good. I really think about this idea that monuments don't have to be permanent. Is really important, because I think that sometimes when they're permanent, they're like deeply entrenched in old values and old visions for society. And me, myself, I'm very much into restructuring society to make it an equitable place. And so what that means is, it means dismantling and tearing down some of these monuments that are no longer reflective of where society wants to go. But I often ask myself, okay, in this current landscape, what monuments will still be standing? What values will we carry on into the future? That's very interesting to me.
I was particularly touched by Kristen's comments about Lalibela and about the sacred dust. And as many of you in the audience know, I've worked in Upper Egypt at a late antique monastic church, and there was definitely a lot of push and pull between use in Coptic liturgical practice and conservation and presentation to the world. And at times, we had to share, and I mean we on both sides, we the Coptic monks and we the conservators and project directors had to actually share the space of the sanctuary. And there were months at a time when the monks would be performing the liturgy, and we would be on scaffolding around them, working on the walls while this was happening. And this is a really astonishing example of creative collaboration, I think. But it really does raise the point about who do these monuments exist for? I mean, I love that church I worked on. That was such a privilege, and I want future generations to be able to experience it and to see it and to share it. But I'm also very aware that it's in the hands of the Coptic Orthodox Church and that it is a living monastic site. And so there's definitely a lot of negotiation that needs to go on with monuments. As we were saying this morning, monuments are never a single thing. They're never a single story. They're very complex. We're going to be turning to questions from the audience in a minute, but I wanted to ask you all a couple of questions before we do that. And whichever of you, any of you wants to answer this, when you think about the monumental topography of Cleveland, what absences strike you? Are you aware of things that have been lost and destroyed? And Grace, of course, you've already addressed that quite powerfully.
I mean, representations of Black and brown people are not highly visible here. But what I really love about Cleveland is how Black and brown folks have created these counter monuments, or being, again, for example, holding direct action in front of the free stamp. That is something that we in our culture do, is reclaim space, take up space, make our presence known in space. But it would be really beautiful for our city to embrace Black architects, Black sculptors, Black media artists, and have them be commissioned to make art that is of the moment. And I think, as I was saying, you know, art, monuments don't always have to be forever. They don't always have to be permanent. But I think that when artists of color have the opportunity to make something that is reflective of our heritage, that has staying power, that, you know, young people can see, you know, when they're children and grow up and it's still there, that's very meaningful to our existence. And so I think that that absence needs to be filled in this moment. Counter monuments are great, but we also have to build things that solidify, like I said, our socio-political relationship to society. And as a Black person, permanence is very important. The fact that we are here and we're still going to be here is an important value that we need in public space.
Great. Any other thoughts?
Well, I'm a newcomer to Cleveland. I moved here in January 2020, which is a very interesting time in the world to be moving anywhere. And frankly, I've seen more of the walls of my apartment than I have of a lot of Cleveland. So I've been thinking personally in terms of Cleveland on the very micro level. What are the kind of personal monuments in a way that my neighbors have established? Who has an expression of their faith, a little altar Virgin Mary in their yard? Who has decorated their house like a ship, believe it or not, complete with life preservers and ropes? What are they choosing to memorialize?
I know that house.
Yes, what are they choosing to memorialize of their own lives and to share with the community? And even if it's transient, as you said, just in the lifetime of the ownership of that house, or if it gets passed down and it stays, what are those small monuments to my neighbors? And I think for me, that's been quite interesting to get to learn through the seasons. And I really do look forward to learning more about the space now that we're a little freer to roam.
One of the ones that's near that house that always makes me smile when I walk around in the morning is a little door that is that someone has put up. It leans against the base of a tree, and it says "Gnomes Only." So, very idiosyncratic. So I guess I want to raise a really difficult question that I have very strong feelings about, and I think a lot of us do, and that is what should be done with monuments that people find harmful. And I'm not expecting us to come to some magical resolution or agreement here. I would just like to hear different opinions from the three of you, and then I'd like to open the floor to comments and questions.
Yeah, I think there's been a common argument, which is like, these things are reflective of the past and we can learn from them, right? And so, maybe removal is more appropriate than destroying. But I do think we're in a dismantling moment. And so the idea of destroying this value or destroying this hegemonic system does communicate something very powerful to community. I don't know what you should do with those actual monuments, but what I do think is that this negative space that then is created, it should be filled with space of atonement. It should be space filled with monuments of reparation, monuments of accountability. You can't just leave it empty. Right? We have to fill it with something. We have to fill it with new values. And we have to think about that filling of that space as a kind of restructuring of society.
Agreed that there is really no one answer, and certainly we are in this moment of dismantling, as you said so perfectly. And I think about this idea of progress and moving forward and thinking, what are moments in the past that we can also look to, and thinking about how monuments have been used or reused or even reappropriated and remixed. I think in any case, specificity is always so important to really understand that object, that community, that moment of creation that is specific to that work. And not to have it be a single person's decision what happens to it, to have it be a conversation of many voices, to think to the specificity, again, of the community that that piece now lives in. I was just thinking in my head very much of a very striking statue at Kwame Nkrumah's gravesite and memorial in Accra, where on one pedestal it's his head, and on the other pedestal it's his body, which was symbolically beheaded at some point when he was deposed. And now it's in a state of honor, but they have not reassembled the statue. So it really works on a dual level. At one level, you are honoring him, and you've got this magnificent memorial to him. But at the other, what happened in the past is not forgotten. The two halves of the sculpture have not been united. And it's very powerful, particularly for people who are learning about a place, to be able to see that history tangible.
I love that. I wish we could cut things in half that way. It'd make everybody happy. To tell you the truth, my feelings and thoughts on this topic are still in motion. And I am really in a position of listening right now. I can see it really from all different ways. I do have to say, though, there's this part of me, I'm from a family of immigrants, and so my history directly is not of this country, and actually my history, a lot of it is lost. It stayed in China, and the generations haven't talked about it. We don't really talk about these things. or there's not a lot of pockets of knowledge that have been filled in. But when I do have to say, I was in the Cleveland Public Library recently, and I was told about, I was in their special collections, and I was told about these two busts of men who had founded the collections and how they had been, recently restored. And they were kind of collecting dust in the dark corners of the hallway. And part of me feels like, libraries today are not that anymore. They're community spaces. And I felt like, let's keep them on the sides, but we need to celebrate the collections that are there now and how they're relevant to us. So I'm all over the place.
So we have new leadership at Case Western Reserve University. Karen and Eric Kaler recently joined our community, and Karen said something very interesting to me after our morning session, which is that it would be fun to visit a garden of toppled monuments. I would love to go to such a place. So please come to the front to either side. We have microphones on stands to assist with social distancing, and give us your comments or questions.
Congratulate the panel. This was a fantastic panel, and it really triggers a lot of thoughts for me. I'm going to ask a question about future memory. There's a way in which all of you are talking about the rich interplay between past, present, but also future. And I'd like to understand a bit more the implications of your work on how the monuments get us to maybe templatize or think about a future, how we are, ordering our memory or our ability to remember down the road, and what the significance of that might be. But what really triggered that is I forget which one of you, but the bridge, and how much that is about the past and about the now, but also about where that community, where the communities want to go as a social project. So just wondering, there's so much in your presentations.
Thank you, Ben.
Can I address that first? Because you
Please.
mentioned the Sideway Bridge. When you were asking the question, that came to my mind immediately, because there is a movement to have the Sideway Bridge rebuilt. And I'd like to say that our artist, started this movement, but she didn't. She jumped on the movement and is now actually actively part of pressing it forward. But the idea of a bridge itself joining communities, that is in itself a beautiful thing. But that this particular bridge reflects our country's history in a way that we're not necessarily proud of. And the rebuilding of this bridge is something that many stakeholders would like to see happen. However, I've come to learn it's part of a bigger, here we go again, system of community and public planning, where just the rebuilding of this bridge as an art piece or a monument that alone can't just happen, but it's part of the community of Slavic Village, where people need to feel the safety of their lives addressed, housing, food, and why are you spending all this money on this bridge when we need to be able to have safe houses? They also, I've heard, why do we want to join the communities again? So I think what's important, what this bridge, is bringing about part of this conversation, but it is hopeful that it can become part of a landmark, that it's not necessarily an object, but it's an experience, and that it does just symbolically bridging into the future, but it sort of it reflects our past, but also joins with what we hope for in the future.
Thank you.
Grace, I think that idea of experience is so important. And as we've been discussing and taking in your presentations, I've been thinking about the idea of process And in a way, we're really looking at two categories. You have things that are purpose-built as monuments, and then you have things that become monuments. And in thinking about your question, I'm not sure what my answer is to that, but I think it's useful to think about intention when we think about past and present in that sense, and also being open to definitions of monuments or things that become monuments that aren't necessarily planned as such.
When you think about future memory, I think it really comes down to what these monuments will do for community. And I think about the multifunctional and dynamic nature of what monuments could be. And so what does it look like as, you know, for example, Shooting Without Bullets, bus shelter that will house artworks of women of color that can serve as also a place of respite in a community that has often been neglected from both representation in art itself and respite. How does it serve the community besides just visual or besides just communicating like a value system? How does it actually improve the lives of the people who are most proximate to it? I think that's a very important question around future memory. I talked about how, you know, the Black body is often in stark opposition to the monuments that are built. What happens when we build monuments that embrace the Black body, that embrace the Black experience, that provide mobility and momentum for communities who have been excluded from these spaces?
Wonderful, future memory. Gosh, that's something to build towards, isn't it? That's really generative. Other comments or questions for our panel?
Hi, this is a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. For better or for worse, monuments on a large scale and on a smaller or room or building scale, they define who actually belongs there, who's welcome there, and who's an authority. So we can say that a space is for everyone, but the environment of that space tells us otherwise. A really good example would be how poorly we design spaces to be accessible to folks who are in wheelchairs. It's sometimes difficult, especially in the historic preservation world, to help people who are in charge of these spaces understand that the preservation of a site or a monument is not more important than the availability of civic space or the feelings of the people who use that space. One of you showed a sculpture of Sims, and in healthcare spaces, it's very easy to make the argument that if you have a lithograph of Sims up on your gynecology office wall, how does that make your patients feel? Does it feel like a safe space? I'm wondering how you've made the arguments to other people in authority who have control over public spaces, how you've shifted them towards change and helped them to see that perhaps preservation is not more important than how people feel in those spaces and how people access those spaces.
Thank you for those thought-provoking remarks.
So I guess as a visual artist and creative director, a lot of my projects are in public space. And aside from the Amplifying Gallery, which it's kind of a beautiful idea, it's a beautiful concept, it's multifunctional, some of my more media-based work, photographic and mural-based work, has actually been censored. It's actually been things that are built that are arguably monuments that have been people have asked for them to be taken down. And they're quite, I mean, they all represent Black people, they all involve youth, but it's this idea of, I think, Black power. We talked about power and presence in space. People are not comfortable with this idea of Black power, and so the first thing that they want to do is censor it, is to take it down. And I guess you could argue, well, isn't that the same thing with these Confederate monuments? No. There's a power at play in that is not in the images that I'm creating. And so I haven't really had the opportunity so much to work with people in power to make sure that these things are staying. I've had to take it upon myself. Like our In Our DNA project was very street-based. We didn't go through a city planning commission process. You know, if you have art that's up for 28 days, you can kind of fudge the process a little bit for those rebels out there. And so we didn't do that. We were just like, hey, ACLU, like, can we install this project? And they're like, heck yeah, it has to do with Stephanie Tubbs-Jones. We're all about it, you know? So we've had to find our own ways to navigate these systems in the face of opposition, in the face of we are critiquing power. So how do you work with power and critique it at the same time? You have to be very smart and dynamic and figure out how to make it exist without going through traditional processes.
I think as an administrator, I've discovered, and people may feel differently, that the community development corporations in Cleveland, to me, are very beautiful things because the way they operate is public-private partnerships to elevate a neighborhood, and people automatically think, you mean gentrify? No. I think what they're doing is working with the people who live there to develop the community in the way that makes the most sense to them. And often this is where I find public art finds its place, because it's working within it's encompassed as part of this larger project. And so the community alone itself is already part of this process. And so specifically in our project, we found them to be great partners because they helped us reach the community in ways that we might not necessarily have been able to, but that also, in a way, we were asking permission, but also we didn't need to have permission because augmented reality, it's there, it's not there, who cares? But we wanted to ask permission because we wanted to set a process, a precedent for which we can talk to people, to the leaders of community to help make something happen.
Yeah. I think it's a little different perspective as working as a curator in a museum. Going back to my introduction, thinking about the idea of making the gallery here more multivocal and thinking about ways to bring people into spaces to give that sense of comfort, to give that sense of ownership, to give that sense that there is a diversity of ideas. Certainly the pandemic has changed ability to do that for the last 18 months or so. But if you go into the galleries now, I hope you'll take a look and see the photographs of Victor Ahekemannor, who is from Benin City in Nigeria and contributed his very lovely photographs of the contemporary court. Victor was very kind in giving advice as I reinstalled part of the gallery, and through that collaboration, we were able to bring in his voice, to bring in another voice. So I know when he comes in, he'll see that represented, and hopefully other folks coming from Nigeria in that way. And again, like we've been coming to over and over, it's the idea of process, it's the idea of inviting people in, and the idea of not seeing things as static.
I think we have time for one more comment or question from the audience.
Thank you so much for today's conversation. It's wonderful. Thank you. Your presentation mentioned freedom from fear. And the earlier session brought up the fact that so much of monuments are war-driven. And so I was thinking the concept of fear and what is the opposite of the concept of fear? And so how to bring that into kind of a physical monumental space. And I was thinking your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Gosh, that's a good question.
Sure is.
Oh, I love that. I think there can be so many different ways. But again, we keep going back to everything that's been said, this idea of welcoming. where I went to undergraduate, there was a sculpture called the Women's Table, and it was a sculpture by Maya Lin, and it's a flat table from which water runs off, and in the center is a spiral, and along the spiral is the number of women who are enrolled as students, and it starts at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and slowly ticks up to 1, 2, 5, 12, all the way up to when gender equity was achieved. And to me, that always felt like the opposite of fear. It's not to say all problems were solved or differences or difficulties solved being an undergraduate woman, but seeing that, walking by that every day, seeing that in front of the library, to me that was the opposite of fear.
Yeah, I think that the opposite of fear is a lot of things. It's safety, security, belonging, possibility. And all of those things can be created by building dynamic monuments. Monuments don't always have to, they shouldn't be monolithic. They don't always have to communicate the same ideas or the same values, but they do need to be ideas and values that are inclusive of all. And like I said, that as we're in this building of society and restructuring society of the moment, we're not to that ideal society that we want to live in. We must make sure that these monuments that are being built or that remain and exist are monuments that center those who are most excluded from public space in history, like Black and brown folks. If you had more representation of Black and brown folks within public space, there would be less of these hegemonic systems, these systems that breed fear, right? There's nothing like seeing these soldiers mounted on horses. If I'm walking around downtown Cleveland and I see that all the time, like, does that make me feel closer and more proximate to my body, to my environment, you know, to the history and heritage of this city? Not really, but if I saw things that looked like me, that had my form, I would feel more safe.
You know, I think it is just a matter of time, too. People willing to take the risk and then being able to share that with other people is sort of one of the ways I'm thinking about it. So I don't have an answer either.
I'd like to just bring in the idea that Provost Vinson raised at the beginning of our discussion session here, and that was future memories. And that made me think of Afrofuturism, and your comment about the absence of fear makes me think about the importance of imagining utopia as we personally identify it, as we as a society identify it, imagining the place where we want to be and not just dwelling on the places where we've been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it is 2 o'clock, and I welcome you to have a 15-minute break and then to join us again for more stimulating conversation. Thank you so much to our three speakers.